from Disney.
A lot of people want to know about my family. Well, we have a magical house and magic gifts.
What's your gift?
Mirabel didn't get one.
This Thanksgiving,
Casita?
The family is in danger.
I'm losing my gift!
It's all gonna come down to you.
I can do this. And at least I'll have a friend. Nope, he flew away immediately. Quitter!
Disney's Encanto. Rated PG. Parental guidance suggested. Only in theaters Thanksgiving.
Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello and welcome to the New Books Network. I'm Pierre Delancey. In the past 10 years, the investigative agency Forensic Architecture has been involved in numerous inquiries into incidents such as human rights abuses, police violence, unlawful killings, or environmental disasters. The work brings together contributions from a wide range of specialists, including architects, forensic journalists, filmmakers, and artists. The agency's work has been presented in courts, in news media, as well as in art and cultural spaces. It has given rise to new scholarship in the nature of evidence and its role in legal processes, and it has also tested its principles in practice. Investigative Aesthetics, Conflicts and Commons in the Politics of Truth, a new book by Matthew Fuller and A.L. Wiseman, reflects on some of the critical developments that the practice of forensic architecture has given rise to. It's an account of the possibilities of an investigative commons of distributed agents to participate in a counter-investigative movement that holds power to account on its own terms. I spoke with the book's authors, A.L. Wiseman, who founded Forensic Architecture, and Matthew Fuller, who is Professor of Cultural Studies at Goldsmiths, University of London, and he's also a member of the Forensic Architecture Advisory Board. Here are excerpts from a conversation. Matthew, let's start with you. Before I ask A.L. to give us some details about the work of forensic architecture that I just alluded to in the introduction, it would be good to have a sense of your role in this project and your research that's brought you to this collaboration.
One of the areas I work in is a field called software studies, and this is a kind of overlap between computer science, broadly speaking, and cultural theory, so a more kind of philosophical approach to computing that draws on political philosophy, aesthetic philosophy, to think about the structure of meaning and the forms of power in contemporary software. So that work has been going on for probably a couple of decades, a bit more, and has taken on different projects ranging from technical analyses of things like search engines, so using different techniques to probe the inner workings of large scale platforms, or more kind of critical writing. So an attempt, part of software studies, an attempt to think about ways in which we can understand software as part of contemporary culture and how it inflects politics, our cultural interactions, thinking about the way in which software produces the stuff of contemporary culture in the present. So whether that's something quite banal like a word processor, or something that is ostensibly more sophisticated like a search engine or a social media platform, the work involves using programmatic tools, that is, technical forms of analysis and conceptual forms of analysis. So a lot of that crosses over with the investigative mode.
Well, we certainly pick up on some of these connections later on in our conversation, but as we get started, Ayal, this particular book, Investigative Aesthetics, isn't precisely a biography of forensic architecture, the organization that you head, but I think it would be great for those of our listeners who are not yet familiar with your work, for you to set the scene and to describe the kind of investigations that you have engaged in on the past decade.
My name is Eyal Weizmann. I am the director of Forensic Architecture, which is a research agency based here at Goldsmiths. If you come here, you'll see a big open space studio that feels something between a newsroom and an artist studio. It's about 20 or 30 of us. And we're working on counter-forensic cases. That is to say, we are working on cases against police forces, militaries, secret services. We're developing new evidentiary tools and techniques that are admissible to courts, but at the same time also presented in other fora, such as in art and cultural ones, in the media, in truth commissions, in citizen tribunals, and generally with social movements. We are best known, I guess, for open source investigative techniques. So I started in the anti-colonial movement in Palestine. I'm Israeli, I'm Jewish, but part of a growing cohort of Palestinian international and Israeli activists that reject colonialism and apartheid as the reality in which we live and try to fight it in different ways. And one of the ways that we do that is by actually documenting doggedly the realities of the occupation. And as an architect, I started documenting the architectural violence, the way in which crimes were committed on drawing boards of architects, the way they were building roads and bridges and buildings in colonies that, sort of bisect Palestinian built fabric, etc. So initially, forensic architecture was imagined as the description of an architectural object that is in itself violence, right? The violence enacted through architecture. So architectural tools describing architectural facts. And I guess we fell upon, in the second decade of our new millennium, on another sort of use and technique, because, towards the end of the noughties, the cartography, drawing, mapping, completely transformed with the emergence or with the combination of Google Earth on the one hand and social media and user-generated material on the other, at the intersection of which to describe physical facts required photographic attention and photographic knowledge. So our kind of techniques turned into a kind of a combination of photographic and architectural intelligence, if you like. And very soon we realized that the only way in which we could inhabit and navigate the endless stream of images that we drowned within today, many of them coming from conflict zones, almost all of them produced by participants in the events, mainly witnesses and people that experience violence firsthand, but also perpetrators. Militaries release their own visual information. The only way to make sense of it is to build it into 3D architectural models that function as anything between a database and a kind of an arena that synthesizes an enormous amount of visual material. So we fell upon that. And what it meant to us is that architecture stopped being the object of analysis, but a method of seeing, a way of seeing. Through architecture, or architecture was our optics through which we could actually describe events as they are taking place. And although it came as a in relative surprise, as I said, we fell upon that kind of technique. Very soon after we've developed it, we realized it became very useful, and it caught up really fast. So you have multiple kind of major news organization like New York Times and Washington Post now adopting the kind of techniques and technologies we develop, all human rights organizations, and now through my advisory role in the International Criminal Court, it becomes sort of like we're working on the admissibility on different kind of categories like provenance and chain of custody and verification.
Could I ask you to give an example from one of the investigations that you have carried out to give listeners an idea of the kind of processes, actors, politics, and sources that are involved in carrying out any of these projects?
Yeah, here is one example. And let me start from a place to the kind of the conflict I feel closest to. In 2014, Rafah, which is the southernmost city in the Gaza Strip, were under huge, ruthless Israeli bombardment. The reason was that Palestinians managed to capture an Israeli soldier or an officer into a tunnel. And there was a kind of punishing violence that happened during that time. Amnesty was unable to enter into the Gaza Strip. And they asked us to reconstruct 24 hours. A few months later, they asked us to reconstruct 24 hours of that conflict, the day that was the most violent within it, August 1st, 2014. So we hoovered in from the internet about, I would say, 7,000 visual material. Some of them were photographed, most of them were videos on different channels, Arabic language, so YouTube channels and Facebook accounts and Twitter, etc. And some of them were sent to us, some of them were journalistic sources. And we were trying to make sense of what do we do with all those images of destruction and how you actually build a timeline. So, the first question that you have when you confront with a clip from a war zone or from a site of police murder or from, anywhere that you investigate is where was it taken and when? So the where is solvable because, in every video you have all sorts of landmarks. Maybe in Gaza you'd have minarets that you can navigate by and you say, okay, here is a cone of vision and here is where it starts. And it's complicated, but you can do that. The when is a bit more complicated when you don't have metadata, and obviously all those platforms strip the metadata off the visual material they send for very good reason. It actually protects the people that send this material. But trying to figure out how to build a timeline is trying to determine what image comes first. You need to tell a story. The story is never existing in one image or one video alone. It always slips between images. It's what happened between the frames that is interesting for us. So how to do that? Sometimes we actually look at the shadows and turn the city or turn architectures like a sundial. We simulate the sun and we see, within 5 minutes we can pretty much determine it. Sometimes we cannot do that. The shadow is nowhere visible or the image is not in high enough resolution. What we've done in Gaza is to look at the sky. It took us about half a year to realize we were looking at the wrong side of the image. And every video of the bombardments of Gaza had a little bit of sky in it, or at least sometimes half a sky. Half the image was a sky. And the sky always had bomb plumes. And the bomb plumes are unique signatures because each one is a unique kind of product of the size of the bomb and the surface in which it encounters, and it's the time of its own evolution, right? A bomb plume lasts for about 10 minutes in the air. So we created a kind of cloud atlas of all cloud forms on the sky over Gaza. We're just looking at the sky and managed to sync up a kind of a time-space map of cloud formation, a kind of like a equivalent of the 19th century cloud atlas, if you like. And then we turned our attention to the ground. And, the sky was simply a kind of a big sort of physical clock for us that allowed us to turn the attention to the ground. And then we could see what's the relation between that video of a tank charging through the city, those civilians running with white flags, this ambulance caught in a fire, in a shooting, sound of a drone or of a plane overhead. And by actually building it up into a space-time map, you can, all those disparate videos, each one representing one single element of a conflict, all of a sudden come together to tell a more major one. And then we realized also we can look at agricultural sensors because where the tanks went during that day, the plants underneath them stopped photosynthesizing. So agricultural sensors on satellite give you a good indication of, the sort of the robustness of vegetation activity. So, repurposing something like that gives you the entire footprint of the tank maneuvered. And now you cross-reference it with testimonies, with the videos, with the audio, with what we knew about where the Israelis thought the tunnels were. And a very disturbing story came about where we exposed a secret Israeli command called the Hannibal Directive, which actually calls or give commanders on the ground, its understanding within the Israeli army is that they are expected to kill a soldier that is taken captive rather than letting him or her fall into enemy's hand because they don't want to bargain later for their release. And that what we were seeing there was effectively an assassination attempt of the army against one of their own. We released that. It was sent also to the ICC, to the International Criminal Court. It's one of the cases now that they are investigating Israel for violation of the laws of war. But it was also shown, we didn't want it only to be presented within sort of judicial framework because we wanted people to understand what it means. And for that reason, I've written about it, placing it within a history on the role of the captive within that particular conflict. We exhibit it in order for people to see our techniques, to learn from them. We don't keep anything proprietorial in what we do. And we discuss the sort of the politics of the law, if you like. So, in a way, different fora allows you different forms of reflection, different level of reflection on the kind of investigations that you undertake.
Yeah, for me, the idea of using a cloud atlas as this kind of investigative tool is still quite mind-blowing. And I'm going to put a link to this particular investigation on the Forensic Architecture website in the episode notes. Eyal, you've mentioned a number of actors involved in an investigation like this. So on the one side, we have the state, we have Amnesty International, we have activists supplying footage and pieces of evidence. But on the other, you have the outputs. And you mentioned the courts, which are, of course, incredibly important in the investigative practice, but you also allude to cultural institutions. And it's important to know that forensic architecture has been exhibited in numerous shows in museums and galleries worldwide. It's been shown in Documenta. It's been nominated for the Turner Prize. So I wonder if you could speak about the role of those kind of fora in disseminating the evidence and your findings.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the task of counterforensics is very different than that of forensics. Forensics in the hand of the state, that kind of confluence of science and policing that emerged in the sort of early 19th century Europe in relation also to the colonial projects. And that is because in counterforensics, you simply don't have access to the scene of the crime. And you sometimes don't have access to the forums that are in charge of arbitrating justice. Very often it is, imagine a street corner, the police murders somebody, they put a cordon around it, they control the narrative. The cordon of area is a space of exception. It's only state agents that can go in. We need something to leak out of it. We need somebody to upload something. We need to start with some weak signal that comes from the cordoned off area. Then, because it is a state crime, some states do not really or do any kind of anything in their capacity to stop you actually entering into court, or when you're in court, for your kind of material to be admitted. And we experienced that when working for the family of Mark Duggan here in exposing the police cover-up and the lies around the reason that the police said he was shot, and the very, showing very clearly he didn't hold a gun in his hand. Sometimes it's more overt, like in Israel, they would say, we're anyway anti-Israeli activists, or worse, we've experienced even worse abuse in terms of the reason for why we work against Israel, and which I don't want to dignify here. So sometimes you want to find an alternative forum. And I don't say that the gallery is equivalent to the court. They do different jobs. Both of them are institutions. Every institution limits what could be said and heard within it. Both have some degree of openness and some degrees of restriction. Who can speak, what can be said, etc. Even when we could bring something to court, we would want to, and we always contract our work with our, the people that ask us to do work in that way, we'd always say that we reserve the right to take a piece of evidence that has been presented in legal fora and do something else with it. We don't want it to only be limited to sort of as a technical service to the judicial system. We want it to do political work. We believe that evidence is only as good as the political process that can use it. And therefore, we would sit with the people we work with, and we'll build a strategy that would say, okay, we'll have it. Obviously, the court always have to come first because they don't like contaminated or dirty evidence, as Matt and I have written, and then we'll take it to the art space when we will do other work with it. When we'll speak about representation, or speak about media, or we'll speak about the political context, we'll maybe even speak theoretically about aesthetics, with a nudge to our to our book. And sometimes we realize that, hey, the art world itself can be complicit in the very human rights violation we are presenting. So, no forum is ever neutral. No institution in our society is a kind of a perfect arena to present material in. What you do is you offset the limitation of what? By taking your evidence from the court to the media, to the art space, etc., to academic environments also.
Avi, I'm interested in hearing from you as a cultural theorist about the relationship of these kind of spaces.
Yeah, I mean, to kind of follow on from what Eyal said, I think if we think of galleries or courts as kind of media systems, if we think of them as ways of mediating and translating requirements or demands for access to facts or access to the truth, or access to experience, access to knowledge, access to forms of perception, they each have their own particular characteristics. So a court will operate in certain ways according to the codes and conventions, the theatre that it works with. And the gallery works in another kind of way, that it kind of people behave in both cases, people behave in different ways. In a gallery, you slow down your movement, you attend to detail, you look at the very specific kinds of objects that are brought together there in certain kinds of ways, with certain kind of attention to detail. In a court, the kind of theatre and rhetoric of the place is again very different, with different kinds of statements allowed, different regimes of enunciation that are made available and that become the stereotypes and cliches of the court. And also certain kinds of acts of power are possible in both regimes or in both media spaces differently. So we see them both as useful, but both having their own tendencies to certain kind of inhibition and certain kind of prohibition on statement, which are relatively self-evident. Where it's possible, though, is to think, what do they make it possible to state, and what kinds of tension can they bring to bear on a political problem. So without any illusion that they're neutral spaces or that they're ideal in any way, we can also say that given their specificity, what is it possible to do in these spaces within these particular kind of historically accrued opportunities? Obviously, there's much that should be contested about these kind of institutions, but they can also be grounds for certain kind of articulation and reinvention of what's possible. And trying to rework them is also part of the work. So Eyal talked about changing the context of the institution in some ways, or pushing its parameters, partly by stepping outside of it and producing other centers of gravity. It's useful to look at a tradition of work in arts practice that has always seen the gallery as one form of articulation of art or of cultural practice, but that it also circulates in other spaces, in the streets, in performance, in people's daily lives. And you can see the kind of the development of different historical movements around their articulation of the interaction of different kinds of space and the different kinds of affordances that these spaces and mediatic systems allow for. So that's how we see these multiple systems that articulate different kinds of possibility.
Well, one recent example of this kind of interweaving of possibilities of different fora is the investigation by forensic architecture into the killing of Mark Duggan. This is the tragic 2011 event, which essentially led to the sparkling of riots in London and across the UK. And this is a project that has accompanied a legal process, multiple state investigations into the incident. I'm going to drop here a couple of clips from the video that was recently shown at the Institute of Contemporary Art in London that accompanied the release of an extensive report into the incident produced by Forensic Architecture. And as before, the links to the full video and the description of both the work and the full report are available in the show notes.
The world is racing to get back to normal and start meeting up in person again. But after the year we've all had, getting back to feeling normal takes time. If you're feeling overwhelmed by it all, you're not alone. Something like 50% of Americans struggle with their mental health. We all need help sometimes. I know I do. So what should you do? Well, you should ask for help. Talkspace makes it easy to get that help. Talkspace matches you with a licensed therapist and makes it easy to schedule live video sessions, all from the comfort of your device. You can start messaging your therapist the same day you sign up, and you work with your therapist on your own schedule without having to wait weeks for appointments. Whether you're a parent, a student, a millennial, or just someone having a hard day, Talkspace can help you feel better. Talkspace offers individual and couples therapy in addition to medication prescription services. Whether you're experiencing depression, anxiety, or other problems, Talkspace is the #1 online therapy platform to help you sort through any issue. Start feeling better with a single message. Match with a licensed therapist when you go to Talkspace.com and get $100 off your first month with the promo code NBN. That's $100 off when you use the code NBN at Talkspace.com.
On the 4th of August, 2011, in Tottenham, North London, Mark Duggan was shot dead by police after the minicab he was travelling in was pulled over. Duggan was being monitored by Operation Trident, a controversial police unit focused on gun crime in London's black communities. Duggan stepped out of the cab, and an officer known only as V53 shot twice, killing Mark Duggan. V53 later told investigators that he saw Duggan holding the gun in his right hand and that he felt his life to be in danger. But while a gun was found at the scene, it was found here, 7 meters away from the site of the shooting. At the heart of that controversy are 2 questions. Could Duggan have been holding a gun? And how did the gun get to the grass? We started by examining hundreds of publicly available documents, including witness statements, diagrams, and expert reports. We travelled to the scene of the killing and took photographs of every part of the site. According to the IPCC, sometime during that period, Duggan threw the gun with enough force to land 7 meters away. If Duggan didn't throw the gun at that time, there are only two alternatives. Either Duggan threw the gun as he exited the minicab, or the gun was moved by police officers. In both cases, Duggan would not have been holding a gun when he was shot and would have posed no threat to the police.
So with the work we just listened to, we are in the gallery, and I guess the question of aesthetics becomes inescapable. And Matthew, I was intrigued to see that in the book you actually treat aesthetics as one of the inputs into the investigative process rather than the output of communicating your findings.
In terms of aesthetics, what we argue for in this book is a relatively straightforward definition of aesthetics, which has two parts. One is that aesthetics is to do with sensing, and what we do is to expand the terrain of what sensing is. So we say that everything in the world senses, whether it's a microphone, whether it's a brick in the wall, whether it's a piece of an area, a stretch of mud or a plant. All of these things are sensing. That is, they receive kinesthetic effects from different kinds of entity that come in contact with them. They change in relationship to the environments that they're in, but they only change according to their specificity. So a book, for instance, may be able to sense in conceptual terms what are the ideas that it sets up and how is it able to articulate a relationship to other ideas or other experiences. But it also may be able to absorb water or to absorb other kinds of substance. So a book has these, at least two registers in which it operates. A brick may receive a bullet, or it may receive, an insect alighting on its surface, one of which it will be able to sense because the bullet will change its structure. The insect landing on it will not be sensible. So there are limits to the way in which everything in the world senses. It's not that we're adopting a completely panpsychist point of view where everything in the world is sentient and intelligent. What we're saying is that everything participates in the world and is pressing in on each other in order to constitute our ecologies, the environments, the societies that we live in. And this sensing is also coupled with the second definition of aesthetics that we work with, that aesthetics is also about sense making, that is, reasoning, reflecting, using memory, trying to understand the world, that is, making sense of the world. And also that sense making has a second characteristic, that is, we're able, in cultural terms and technical terms, to make new kinds of sensing apparatus. So to make devices, to make code, to make artistic works, to make procedures, social arrangements, to make a politics that is sensible to novel kinds of things, that pays attention to the world in certain ways. And this three-part aspect of there's three dimensions of aesthetics is the kind of broader proposition in the book about what aesthetics contemporarily consists of. So on the one hand, it's ecological and it's post-human. It decenters the human and the reasoning human as the center of the world. And it also says that sense-making is productive, that we can also invent. So it's also an invitation for people to think, okay, how do we invent the world? How do we invent new forms of aesthetics that are adequate to understanding the kind of problems that are faced today?
Well, it shouldn't surprise me that you mentioned bricks in this context, given that we're talking about forensic architecture, but you're not, in fact, the first one of my guests to dwell on the potential of these objects. So I wonder if we could use this example to expand a little bit on the epistemic potential of a system in which we are now surrounded by sensing objects. So we've moved on from our quite limited set of senses of vision, taste, smell, touch, and so on, to a world in which we might actively want to invest into turning our environments into sensing, into aesthetics objects?
Yeah, I think one could say that, say, a brick or any other object in the world can be interpreted as a carrier of meaning, but meaning is also an act of interpretation. If we argue that knowledge is not present in bricks, they're not knowing subjects, but they also carry affordances, as James Gibson, the environmental psychologist, proposes. So an affordance is a quality of an object that allows something to be done with it, whether it's an idea, whether it's a material substance like a brute material substance like a brick. A brick, for instance, is very good for picking up with a hand. It offers the affordance of being picked up. And the size of bricks has emerged over time in order to interact with the affordances of the human hand. Some architects have tried to work with differently sized bricks, and these have often caused injury to the bricklayers because they don't work with the hand so well. So you could say there's a kind of meaning imposed or meaning derived there because it involves a kind of class violence on bricklayers and their kind of ability to work with the materials when the material changes in a way that causes them injury. This is one example in which a wider framing of the question of how to understand the world comes into play, in a sense. So you talk about an epistemic question and how to rework the epistemic in this case, in the situation where we have to recognize that the human isn't the only thing that is producing experience or undergoing the world. So in this case, we have to start looking at different kinds of actor, different kind of entity that exist in the world. So, often in some of the cases that we're interested in, there might be, for instance, plants that bear traces of certain chemicals or certain kinds of that bear traces of certain kind of events. For instance, ER mentioned different kinds of sensors that are able to pick up certain kinds of receptivity of plants to sunlight, depending on how they've been treated and so on. Or you can look at some of the kind of historical accounts of the Highland clearances, for instance, where because the people who traditionally inhabited the highlands were removed in order to impose sheep as the primary form of agriculture, the plants that they ate changed. And, the deposition of droppings around settlements changed. So the fertilization of the ground changes. So you can read the ecological and social catastrophe that was the Highlands clearances in the herbiage that grows in these spaces. And, this is something that aesthetically is something to pay attention to. I mean, for instance, the poet J.H. Prynne writes exactly about this. This changing of plant growth in his poetry around the sites of the clearances, for instance. And so this is something that we see has a long history in aesthetic work of different kinds. And the question then becomes, how do you pay attention to the ways in which different kinds of experience in the world and different kinds of undergoing the world, how do you pay attention to the ways in which these things are known? So certainly that means talking to botanists, to farmers, to peasants working with agriculture in these kind of cases. But it also means finding technological means by which these things can be understood. So looking for different kinds of sensors. One of the sources of inspiration that we have is work by the sociologist and designer Jennifer Gabrice, the artist Susan Shupley, as well as work by artists such as Lawrence Abu Hamdan and others. who've all been looking at different ways to pay attention to the way the world composes itself and how different kinds of materials in the world record, make sense of, or re-articulate and translate events that happen in the world. So this we see as a kind of a broader a current of work in contemporary art, but also in contemporary social practices of different kinds that recognize that the world is made up of more than humans, and of attempting to find ways of translating the experience of multiple kinds of entity, multiple kinds of being, into means that we can have some kind of dialogue with, or we can gain some kind of understanding of, even if we can never fully understand them.
I want to go back for a moment to the received understanding of aesthetics, that is the Kantian tradition, which applies to aesthetics as a form of judgment of representations. So, in as much as you disavow in your definition and in the arguments in the book much of what we have picked up from Kant, I wonder how you see investigative aesthetics in dialogue with the various theorizations of aesthetics in relationship to art and politics.
I think what we aim to do is to not engage in representation, but to engage in translation. So this, if we say that, and this is following the work of Michel Serres, the French philosopher who recently passed away, I think his work has been incredibly important for us in thinking through these kind of questions, as well as others who've been influenced by his work, such as Bruno Latour and Isabel Stengers. What we're looking at is the way in which every interaction between things transforms both the things that are interacting, but also the things that pass between them. So there's, when you say something to me, I'm understanding it from within my terms of reference. I'm translating what you say into my own internal representation. So when we talk about this kind of question of how aesthetics occurs, for sure it involves representations, but it also, those representations are the result of translations. And those representations are in turn translated as they move from one form of mediation to another. Yeah. So, for instance, the conversation we're having, if it was transcribed and turned into a text, it would probably look kind of like gobbledygook. There is a difference between spoken and written language. So even within the same, or roughly the same material, there are differences according to convention. So to translate one medium into another, so a recorded speech into written speech, requires translation. And there is information lost in that translation. So from tone of voice, timbre, the interaction of speakers, and so on. What we want to do is to take all of these things into account, and we think that the aesthetic fields, which is art in the broadest sense, has always been extremely good at recognizing the nuances of these translations. So what we say is, as well as making pictures of things, that is to represent them, we also say that to understand and to bring forward the question of translation is really crucial, because it allows the work of aesthetic work on materials to come to the fore. So how, for instance, translating a video into machine learning, a data that machine learning program can work on, involves a translation. And that translation has potential difficulties. It has potential consequences in terms of the kinds of statements that can be made about it, or the kind of learning that can be done. So all of these processes, even if they're as ostensibly neutral as a satellite image or a computer program, involve transformations, involve translations. And we want to trace the way these translations are active in producing the world.
Eyal, I want to turn to you. Matthew a moment ago referred to poetry and botany as sources of knowledge and sources of information in investigations. But I want to ask you about the kind of technological and maybe also political changes that have enabled the development of what you term counterforensics and counterinvestigation.
Okay, I guess the kind of book that we've written could only come about at this moment in time, at this moment in technological time, and in this moment in political time, meaning the challenges that come from neo-fascist governments around the world that want to attack truth, if you like, in a very general way, by attacking the institutions that buttress truth, and doing that in order to oppress, kill, and rob. If this sounds like the post-truth argument sounds like a new phenomena, I would say that everyone that worked in an anti-colonial struggle is very, very familiar of that, because that's what colonialism is a kind of epistemological wrecking ball that distorts the facts that you see in front of your eyes. So when you have such an attack on the epistemological foundations of society, there is kind of two options. On the one hand, you say, let's buttress, let's support the New York Times, pay for independent journalism, let's give more resources to the FBI, let's support the police and the judiciary and expertise. If they say there is nothing like expertise, let's bring on the experts. And we say the opposite: let it fall. Let it fall, because there are problems with the way in which institutional knowledge is organized. Let's build something else. Let's take this moment, this incredible technological, epistemological, political moment, build something else out of it. Something that is collaborative, something that is unexpected, something that combines the sensibilities of filmmakers and artists with those of scientists and lawyers and activists, and always organized around the leadership of the people at the forefront of struggle, whose knowledge of conflict is a form of expertise, if you even want to use that term. It's definitely a form of knowledge, embodied knowledge, situated knowledge, that is extremely useful to even understand what it is that you see. So I guess that in a sense, what we're talking about is really a way in which investigations, which sounds like a very niche thing, but basically we're talking about understanding the world around us, like kind of having an image of the real that is produced, that is made, that is contingent, that is imminent, that is elastic, but still grasping and describing that image is always a collective process, and it needs to be grabbed from the sort of the mouth of those in charge of the kind of the priests of truth that I mentioned earlier.
Well, at this stage, I want to introduce another short clip from an investigation called Triple Chaser, which Forensic Architecture produced with the artist Laura Poitras. And I'm interested in this investigation for a couple of reasons. One of them is the very observable effect that the project had on the individuals and organizations that are mentioned in it. And again, I'll place links to relevant stories in the show notes. And a second reason that this is an investigation that brings together a few of the elements that we've been talking about. That is the aesthetic, the artistic, the machine-made, the human-made, into one package. So we'll listen to an extract from the work, and the full video is available on the Forensic Architecture website.
On November 25th, 2018, U.S. agents fired tear gas at migrants on the Tijuana-San Diego border. The tear gas was manufactured by the Safariland Group, owned by Warren B. Kanders, the vice chair of the Board of Trustees of the Whitney Museum of American Art, which commissioned this work. In response, Forensic Architecture is training a machine learning classifier to search for images of tear gas grenades manufactured by the Safariland Group. We took as our test case the Triple Chaser tear gas grenade manufactured by Defense Technology, a subsidiary of Safariland. We recreated all the permutations of Triple Chaser branding around the world. We set the model against bold patterned backgrounds to ensure that the classifier learns to identify the grenades. In 2016, Warren B. Kanders gave $2.5 million to the Aspen Music Festival. Now that we've created a synthetic data set, we train the machine learning algorithm to recognize Safariland Triple Chaser tear gas grenades. Safariland's safety guidance provides the following information to doctors. Severe allergic skin reaction, bronchial spasms, and anaphylactic shock are possible. Irritant to eyes. Irritant to skin and mucous membranes. Breathing difficulty. Disorientation.
So, in the back of this work, I want us to think a little bit about the kind of universe in which the machine is now involved in pretty much every aspect of both sensing and sense-making. So, in the clip that we just heard from Triple Chaser, we arrived at a situation where the line between the sensing possibilities of the human and the machine are completely blurred.
When we started, there was always a handful of videos and visual materials around incidents, 6, 7, 8, 12, As we kept on working, the amount of material and the length of material increased. So, the difference, we write in the book that the difference between the 2015 Black Lives Matter and Hong Kong protests, the famous umbrella protests, and then those that happened in 2020 and 2019, in the case of Hong Kong, are incredibly, they're very similar political events, but they're very different media events. When we were working on the brutality and repression of the Black Lives Matter protest, we came across amount of live stream material that was kind of impossible to process by our open source human researchers. They needed help. They needed help with the first step. We needed to start writing scripts and then finally machine learning classifiers to help us identify where within, those 100 4-hour-long videos you see a particular launcher of tear gas or particular type of tear gas grenade. And then we needed to train the machine how to see and how to identify those. And it's like training, it's a little bit, Matt would tell you differently, I'm sure. It's a little bit like teaching a child how to identify an object. You show it many times, you show it from different perspectives. We realized that, after several thousand iteration, when you show the classifier, you say that's a tear gas grenade, that's a tear gas grenade, that's not a tear gas, this is a tear gas grenade, this is also, even when it's rusted, it's still a tear gas grenade, and even if it's squashed, it's still a tear gas grenade, right? So you go through that sort of all this permutation and iteration, then you send it out on the wild, and it comes start bringing you plumbing equipment. Okay, so you go again, and then we realize that the best way to train the algorithm for us is to engage in something that exists within sort of machine learning communities. It's called synthetic data sets. So we use our ability to fast modeling object and to produce permutations in objects. So for our modeler, it takes a few days to produce 10,000 iteration of a single tear gas grenade in Unreal or in any other gaming engine. You trick the machine to say that's a real one, and you say that's what it is, and then it kind of improves its capacity to learn faster. Especially when we're looking for banned munitions, like chemical munitions, there are not enough examples of them online as images, so you need to actually simulate them and do that. But what it also allows you, the synthetic data sets, is to introspect the algorithm itself. because we do not fully know the machine learning processes that happen computationally within that. We know what we put in and what we get out. There's a kind of a black box that is in there. And we realize that it's very important because that black box, for us, it does something great. And, for human rights or for, some resistance, etc. But for other people, it would do something horrible. So we need to expose also the potential violations that happen within this black box. And by creating iterative changes to the input and recording precisely the output of that classifier, we can shed a little bit of light into that process. And that is something that we call introspection. And it is central to the book and it's central to the work of FA. If we use a tool and a technology, would use it to investigate human rights out there in the field, but will also investigate its own potential bias, the own inherent violence that perhaps is within it, their own hierarchies that are within it. And so we've done in relation to satellite images and showing why they're pixelated in places more than others, and we've done in terms of both using machine learning to speed up our human right process and also to shed some light on the algorithm itself. And we found strange things that help us understand why the computational process works the way it does. Matt?
Well, I think one way into it is to understand that computers are inherently cultural, and everything that goes into a contemporary computer and the historical accrual of what computing is as a field has cultural roots, that is, roots in terms of the way the world is understood, the way the world is modeled, what counts as something that can be said or not said. And some of those are to do with the basic structures in mathematics or in logic. Some of them are to do with the economies of electronics and the political economy of intellectual property. Others are to do with the conventions of different cultures and the way in which different cultures are able to encode certain norms into software, for instance. And what we aim to do in the book is to understand technology as something that is inherently cultural and political, because everything that is able to speak, everything that is able to sense, has an engagement with the world as an intersection of multiple flows of power, as well as multiple flows of sensing, experience, reflection, and articulation of sense-making. And computing is no different in some senses because of this, where computing becomes especially important for the present is because much of social life, much of interaction, much of warfare, much of scientific knowledge, much of people's experience has moved on to digital platforms, computer-mediated experiences of multiple different kinds, and this is where politics takes place in many cases. So we need to understand this terrain. We need to understand it as being complexly articulated as cultural, but also as political, and as a space that has its own particular qualities. And some of those qualities are quite mundane to the digital. The question of what the digital is. Something is either on or off. For instance, we also need to learn about the specificity of particular algorithms in texturing our experience of the reality of computing. When we think about how knowledge of the current epidemic emerges, for instance, we think about the the experience of the epidemic as a bodily process, but it's also one that's very much caught up in technical systems of tracking and tracing, of models of epidemics and of epidemiology, of understanding the virus as something that can be technically known, but also its passage between people can be articulated through tracking it in different ways, refining the models, projecting them forward, projecting them backwards, of the interaction of very old mathematical models of probability, such as Bayes' theorem, into our experience of the world, in terms of how we calculate what is probable based on what we already know, and how, when we go through the next phase of gathering data or the next phase of experience, we then change our model and what we can expect in the future. And this kind of experience of something that is happening globally, that's happening differentially according to different apportionings of wealth and importance across the world, which are highly gendered, highly racialized, and highly colonial, are also things that are experienced through scientific knowledge, through everyday experience, and through the way in which economies apportion value. These are all things that we know through different degrees of artificiality. That is, dashboards that map the spread of the virus, tests that allow us to know whether we've, with some degree of probability, got the virus or not, or have got the right level of antibodies. And this knowing or experiencing the epidemic is something that is mixes global scales of knowledge, global scales of experiences, with very intimate ones of being a recipient of the virus, or of being the recipient of the vaccine, or of not receiving the vaccine, of not being deemed worthy of having it, and of undergoing illness according to what has happened in our life, and so on. So this mixture of scales of the kind of global phenomena, and of large-scale computational processes that analyze the epidemic as it unfolds, and of being this something that hooked into people's intimate experiences of life. That's something that we call this kind of experience is something we call hyperesthetic. So it's this massive magnification of the individual experience in relationship to a wider ecology of sensing and undergoing.
Well, the pandemic is an example of another set of conditions that you describe in a book, which you term hyperesthesia. So if hyperesthetics is a state of enhanced sensing, enhanced witnessing, hyperesthesia is a state of sensory overload. I think one of the examples that you give is, for instance, the state of torture. Something like waterboarding involves sensory overload. But you also talk about information overload as something that is potentially a form of combat or warfare. So how do we guard against becoming involved in that kind of sensory overload?
Yeah, I mean the way we talk about hyperesthesia is that it's part of a set of strategies for dealing with sensing as the terrain of politics. So if we see politics as being one of the key grounds for understanding contemporary aesthetics, and aesthetics as the way in which politics is made in the present. So if we think of the political understanding that we have of the world through, for instance, social media, where everything is a matter of urgency, or as a matter of immediate affect and taking up of affect, that something spreads virally as it moves from one person's consciousness to another without even necessarily becoming fully conscious. The question of the politics of aesthetics becomes really crucial. So one of the strategies we believe that's emerging in the present as a way in which politics unfolds in aesthetic terrain is aesthetic overload. And obviously, there's been since the middle of the 20th century, there's been a discourse on information overload as a problem for humans, something that emerges particularly in that cybernetics attempts to address as a discourse, and to try and make vast amounts of information tractable and understandable. So this is a model of the world that's already strongly linked to the history of technology. It's one of the kind of genealogies of computing is an attempt to deal with information overload and to make information navigable, understandable, and so on. What we argue in the book is that there's a condition in which information now is treated by different systems, whether they're political or mediatic systems, not as something which attempts to make rational sense, but that attempts to occupy conceptual space, or attempts to occupy what Yves Citon calls the economy of attention, the way in which cognitive load is placed upon people's brains, almost like a denial of service attack that hackers would do on a website or a server. Denial of service attack is carried out on people's cognitive capacity as a key strategy in politics at the moment. So politics of sensing therefore extends also into a kind of politics of cognition. What is drawn to people's attention, how people's cognitive capacity is saturated with different kinds of sensory undergoing.
Well, we've covered an incredible amount of ground here so far, but before we wrap up, I want to ask you both for yet another practical solution to some of the problems we've identified. And it's something that is, I think, core to the work of forensic architecture and agencies in its ilk, like Bellingcat, which is the fact that the expertise deployed is distributed, that there is a sense of the commons. And you do propose in the book the idea of an investigative commons. So I'd like to ask you both to speak about how you see expertises and investigative sensory agents coming together.
Absolutely. And I think that it's not really about saying that form of expertise are not important. On the contrary, it's about how to build another diagram of relation between that does not put the expert as in a kind of outside position looking down, but is part of an immanent field of making and of becoming. So that, the expert and the person that experienced violence and remembers or forgets or needs, to work on, sometimes with us, on recollection. The lawyers, the artists, the filmmakers, the archaeologists, the car mechanics, if there's a car, the biomechanic experts, are all part of a kind of a very extensive diagram of truth production, and that produces two things. One, it produces a kind of an account that we hope is approximating best what has happened. And second, it's producing a community of practice, and those communities can disperse, obviously, but something is left and something can be returned to when needed, not only in kind of, charting out the horrors of the world. So, it's not really, there's no argument